Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Nisha Sayed and I'm a first year studying government at the college. And I'm a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live and interact with our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for behind-the-scene highlights. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guest and IOP Director, Mark Guerin.
Thank you, Nisha, for the introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum for a really interesting and timely conversation about nuclear energy, climate, and the bomb. And we're very fortunate to have a great panel and moderator here for this interesting discussion and questions from the audience during the course of the next hour. We warmly welcome back Secretary Ernest Moniz back here to the Institute of Politics and to the Kennedy School. He has had a distinguished career both in higher education and his own public service. He is trained at Boston College and his doctoral work at Stanford University, and has been a longtime member of the faculty at MIT, currently a emeritus faculty member and senior special advisor to the MIT president. His own public service is certainly noteworthy in two administrations, in the Clinton administration, working in senior roles at the White House Office of Science and Technology and Undersecretary of Energy. And then, of course, in the Obama administration as the Secretary of Energy for the second term. He is the co-chair and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a nonpartisan group working to prevent the catastrophe of weapons of destruction and disruption, both chemical and biological, nuclear, and cyber. He is also CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative in Washington. So he brings vast experience to this conversation, and we warmly welcome you back. He is joined by Dan Poneman, who served during the Obama administration as the Deputy Secretary of Energy for all 8 years, and the second term with Secretary Moniz. He too brings to the forum a combination of his own public service in the Clinton administration as the Senior Director of the National Security Council, and then, of course, in the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary of Energy. He's a graduate of Harvard College and graduate work at Oxford and Harvard Law School, practiced law and served as a principal at the Scowcroft Group, and now is the president and CEO of Centrus Energy Corporation. His recent book, his fourth book, is entitled Double Jeopardy: Combating Nuclear Terror and Climate Change. It was published last year by MIT Press. And he and Secretary Moniz have authored work together on this topic in 2004, Making the World Safe for Nuclear Energy for Survival. So Dan, too, brings his own scholarship in this area, his public service. We warmly welcome you back. What is not in his bio, which must be noted as a footnote, is that for our 4 years here as undergraduates, Dan was my college roommate. So welcome back, Dan, in this way. And then finally, and we're thrilled to have Dr. Meghan O'Sullivan here as our moderator, known well to the Kennedy School here as a Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of Practice of International Affairs, and she is also the director of the Geopolitics of Energy project here at the Kennedy School. And her own public service extends to the Bush administration and senior roles in the State Department and as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan. She's a board member here at the Belfer Center and other important nonprofits like the Mission Continues, as well as the Women's Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. Dr. O'Sullivan is a graduate of Georgetown and her doctoral work at Oxford, and her work is also widely published, and her most recent book was entitled Windfall: How the New Energy Abundance Upends Global Politics and strengthens America's power. So we have an extraordinary group to unpack these important issues. We warmly welcome you to the forum, and we thank Meghan for moderating. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark, for those introductions, and thank all of you for coming here tonight to spending an hour with us to discuss a very important issue. I'm thrilled to be on stage with two friends and colleagues, both of whom I admire greatly for the work that they did in government, as cited earlier, but also for their ability to really enhance and bring greater understanding to key issues, particularly those surrounding the nexus of energy and technology. And that's actually what we're hoping to do tonight. We're hoping to leave everybody in this forum and online with a better understanding of where nuclear energy can fit into the energy transition, which is a topic that is constantly under examination at the Kennedy School and, of course, in our country and around the world. We've learned a lot about the challenge of climate change. We get new information every few months. In the last 6 or 8 months, I think there's been a torrent of reports that has really alerted us being the global community, to the extreme nature of the problem, and more information that suggests that we should expect more climate challenges in a shorter time period and at a lower temperature change than people originally considered. When I first started talking to people about climate change, the conversation was much more about climate and changes that would happen in a generation or two from now, and now we're all living in this moment. So we've learned a few other things about climate change as well, not just the need for action, but also we've had good news on renewable energy. And we've seen over the last couple of years in particular that the cost of renewable energy has come down dramatically, creating new opportunities for meeting this challenge of climate change. But I would say, and we'll get into this, but I'd say there's a growing realization that the nature and the scope of the challenge of climate change demands more than just being addressed by renewable energy. And that's where we come back again to the issue of nuclear energy. And that's actually going to be my starting point tonight with our two fabulous guests to talk about to what extent is nuclear energy essential to meeting the climate challenge? And if it is essential, how can we assess the risks associated with nuclear energy, and how can we perhaps mitigate those risks? So with that, I'm going to begin by asking our panelists some questions, but I do want to mention again that Dan Poneman has this great book out, which I had nowhere to put it except to bring it on stage when it was handed to me.
Can I buy one?
Double Jeopardy, Combating Nuclear Terror and Climate Change, which I really think puts a lot of these issues in perspective for us. So let me begin with you, Ernie. And I want to begin with this question about, is it feasible, do you think, for the world to meet the challenge of climate change with renewables only? Or do we need to look to other zero carbon energy sources outside of renewables? And if so, how much nuclear energy do you think the world needs in order to combat climate change? And I know this is an issue of some debate. There was the person who was the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission last year came out with a Washington Post op-ed saying, I used to be in favor of nuclear energy because I thought it was essential to meeting the challenge of climate change, but now we have renewables and I think it's not so important anymore. So it's an active debate, and I think we'd really appreciate your views and welcome Dan's chiming in on this point as well.
Okay, well, thanks, Meghan. First, I think it's worth emphasizing really something that you said. I would just add a punctuation mark at the end, that even in the 4+ years since Paris, the challenge has been recognized as even much greater. So in Paris, there was this statement about an 80% reduction from 1990 to mid-century, and now you see increasingly internationally on 4 continents so far, in the United States, in various states and cities, the statement, no, now it's got to be net zero. The net is very important. That means that you need some negative carbon technologies. But fundamentally, this is really pushing the envelope in terms of deep decarbonization. So now your question started with, can we do it with renewables? First of all, I'm going to assume that, at least for the sake of discussion, you really mean wind and solar. here. I mean, because obviously we could have some geothermal, we have some hydro, and people argue whether that's if that counts or not. But let's just say wind and solar, the variable or intermittent resources. My answer to the question is no. It's just not possible. And the reason is that we hear a lot about batteries coming into the system, and that's clearly very important, and battery costs themselves are coming down. But don't kid yourself. Batteries will address the storage requirements to manage wind and solar on a period of hours. Now let's look at the data. I know it's inconvenient, but let's look at the data. For example, I'm just going to focus on data from California because we did a big drill down there, but we could go elsewhere. I think it's just really important to really understand. First of all, just looking at the data of the dispatch of wind hour by hour over a year, what we found was there were 90 days in the year with no wind in the state, and as many as 10 days in a row. A few hours of storage is very important, but not sufficient. I'm just taking a few snippets. Let's look at solar seasonally. There is this inconvenient thing called latitude. Not very hard to explain. California, it translates into a ratio of 2-to-1 sun in the summer to the winter. If you're going to have a system dominated by, actually wind has the same pattern, it turns out. If you're going to have a system dominated by that, you better figure out seasonal storage in a serious way, etc. And by the way, in California, we dismissed hydro, but let me add hydro in for the sake of argument right now. A lot of people, including in California, don't realize A, hydro is an enormous contributor to their system, and B, it has incredible annual variations, especially in drought cycles. So in other words, it's not just the supply, and to say that renewables, wind and solar, have become cheap, on the one hand is correct, narrowly defined. But the issue is you've got to talk about the system cost that you would need to have a system with storage at all of those timescales. And we just don't have it today in renewables. We do have it today in natural gas. That's why the system survives the penetration even that we have today in California. So then the real question is going to be, going to mid-century and net zero, how are we going to transition away from the emissions of natural gas? So carbon capture is one option. But there's also the issue, and if not that, then we need another way of addressing these fluctuations. But the other issue is if you have substantial, quotes, zero, it's quotes for everything, by the way, zero carbon nuclear, that tremendously reduces your needs for managing that whole system integration for reliance and resilience. So my answer would be, is nuclear essential, literally in that sense? I would say no. I can think of other ways around it. But does nuclear help a solution? Enormously, the answer is yes. Nuclear on the scale of what we have today, 20%, 30%, makes an enormous difference as a foundation for zero carbon electricity. And finally, let me say something that I should have said at the beginning. A necessary condition for reaching deep decarbonization of the economy is that electricity, the electricity system, is the lead horse. And by the way, that's proving out in front of our eyes. Today, our electricity sector in the United States, since 2005, is above 30% reduction in carbon emissions. Nuclear has been flat, but the increases in gas for coal and renewables have had that leading. We need that, and we need to have as much electrification of the rest of the economy as possible. In transportation, in industry, certainly in buildings, it won't be complete. But the more we decarbonize electricity and then spread it into other sectors, the job we have. And that's where, again, nuclear takes on added importance in dramatically improving the odds of getting that integrated solution for the entire system. Sorry, that was a long answer. But
No, that's excellent.
Right.
Thank you. So Dan, just building on that, are you able to give us a sense of how much nuclear power the world is looking at? And also, would you maybe comment on the situation in the United States?
Yeah.
Ernie mentioned 20%. The US is meeting 20% of its electricity through nuclear power, and that's been more or less true for 20 years, as I understand it. But is this a signal that the industry is on solid footing, or are you concerned about the trajectory of the US system? So that's really two questions. What's the global
Right.
need, and what's the situation here in the US?
In terms of the global need, I agree with everything Ernie just said. We're talking about net zero by mid-century. And by the way, we're projecting 100% increase in electricity demand by that time. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found in their 1.5 degree report that the goal even of limiting climate change, global warming, 2 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels is really not enough. By 2050, under that scenario, you will lose 99% of the world's coral reefs. You know, Arctic sea ice in the summer. You might save 20% of the reefs with 1.5 degrees. So that's the target. And how do we get there? How much do we have and how much do we need? To pick up another aspect of Ernie's comment, in California, before the big push on wind and solar that began in 2011, they got 53% of their electricity from clean sources. After 7 years of building up 34 billion kilowatt hours of wind and solar, they were now at 53% of power from clean energy sources because they lost 36 billion kilowatt hours of nuclear and hydro over the same period of time. If you look at the International Energy Agency, it's the same thing. In 1998, we had 36% of our power from clean sources. In 2018, we had 36%. So in short, we're making zero progress when we need to be heading to zero. Now, how are we doing? The second part of your question. In the United States, it does seem like an awfully long time. It's been 20%, now it's 19%. But according to the Energy Information Administration that Ernie and I both love, it's going down.
You can add me to that.
And Meghan, it's going down to 12% by 2050, and much of that happens in the next 10 years as we face the prospect of retirements. If you go to the International Energy Agency and we look globally, they are projecting a decline of 2/3 of existing nuclear power. So we're going in exactly the wrong direction. There are reasons to be hopeful because there is growing recognition of like Ernie likes to say, that's not math, it's arithmetic, that you don't get the arithmetic that you need to solve climate change without nuclear. There's a lot of enthusiasm. I think we'll talk about some of these things further on in our conversation. There have been laws passed that are promoting long-term power purchasing agreements that will support nuclear in this country. So to your last part of your question, Meghan, I would say in the United States, there's serious interest, I'd even call it bipartisan interest, in promoting nuclear energy as a response to climate change and also as a response to the need for U.S. leadership on other issues we'll talk about, like national security and nonproliferation. But it's going to be a slog. There's no question about it. It's a challenging situation because there are a lot of public policy concerns that remain unresolved in the minds of many.
May I just say, Regan, since Dan mentioned again the nuclear in California, again, as a factoid, from 2011 to 2012, California had an unanticipated, unplanned loss of about 1/6 of their generation because the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant shut down. It turned out permanently for a technical reason. And it was, at the same time, the first year of a drought cycle that hit the hydro. And there was no problem. The reason, of course, was because they had natural gas infrastructure, natural gas. So the question is going to be, as we go to very low carbon, how are we going to keep that system together to continue to provide reliable, affordable, et cetera, electricity as we are going to zero carbon? It's going to be a real challenge because, frankly, in many ways unseen, gas has been the thing that actually has enabled the large growth in renewables. But that can't go on forever.
Yeah, and just before we move to another point, Dan, might it be worth saying a few words just about why the U.S. is going from 19 to 12%? Is it that natural gas is easier, cheaper, all of these things, or are there other factors at play?
Yes. Well, a very famous CEO of Exelon, major utility, said, for nuclear energy to be competitive in a merchant, like deregulated market, you need to have natural gas prices of $8 and a price on carbon of $25. And we have neither of those two conditions, point one. Point two, the United States, after the 1979 Three Mile Island episode, basically didn't build a new nuclear power plant for 30 years. We got out of practice and we got slow at it. And so when they finally started building these plants again, they were very much behind schedule and over budget. So I would say the viability and the apparent viability of nuclear power in the conventional sense was really challenged. And at the same time, candidly, there are still concerns about waste. There's still concerns about proliferation. There's still concerns about safety. And so that's why I think it's been really challenging in the United States. And it's every once in a while, every few years, there comes a bow wave of support for nuclear, often based on these climatic considerations, and then something will happen. One time it was Fukushima, and every time something like that happens, we have a setback. Now we're again in a moment where there is renewed enthusiasm because principally climate concerns, and there's a new wave of advanced technology reactors that promise to address many of the concerns that people have had with the former generation of nuclear power plants. And I don't want to go on too long, so we'll leave that for a bit later, but I think some of these new technologies have the ability not only to address some of the substantive concerns that people have, but also to rebuild public confidence in this technology.
Great. Okay, so if we look at this and we think of it as a puzzle, I see the piece, we need a lot of nuclear power globally. And then I see the piece, doesn't appear to be coming from the US. So my question to you, Ernie, is where's this going to come from? What countries are at the forefront of building a lot of new nuclear power capacity? And what are the risks associated with that, with the potential for other countries in the Middle East and elsewhere to become having significant civilian nuclear power? How easy is it to go from having a civilian nuclear power plant to actually having nuclear weapons?
Okay.
It's a lot of questions.
Wow. First of all,
You snuck that in.
First of all, on a lot of nuclear power, well, a lot is a fairly ambiguous term.
Right.
By some rational definitions, the answer is very short, China. Now, then there are other countries that are certainly building nuclear power plants, Russia, India, et cetera. We have limited operations in the Middle East today. Look, the answer is, I would say, on the scale that Dan has talked about, we don't have a lot of nuclear power being built in the world, to be perfectly honest. Even in China, building 50-some plants, you're talking a few percent of the electricity. So right now, it's not happening. And I'll go to your second part of your question, but just to touch on what Dan said, I do think that the issue has to be, and I think it's a multi-decadal issue, whether or not the new technologies ever get deployed, because they do have the attractive features that Dan mentioned, and also much greater flexibility in deployment, because by and large, we're talking about much smaller reactors, which has all kinds of facets that we could come back to if you wish. But going to your other question, we should keep in mind that the possibilities of a nuclear build-out being a facilitator for a weapons program certainly cannot be ignored. We know historically we have reasons to be concerned. But the concern is not the nuclear power plant. The concern is the nuclear fuel cycle. Right. And so it's really a question of how do you make either of the two essentially weapons materials, high-enriched uranium or plutonium. Well, high-enriched uranium, you enrich uranium. And so the question is, do you stop at 4 or 5% for today's nuclear fuel, or in most cases, let's say, clandestinely use the same technology to go up to weapons grade? Plutonium is on the backside. When you take the fuel out of a reactor, the irradiated fuel has got plutonium, which can be separated out. So it's fundamentally a question of either ideally not having enrichment or reprocessing in other countries, or, and Iran deal, in situations where that is the fact on the ground, then turning to an extraordinary verification regime to provide confidence that there is no diversion of the technology or the material to a weapons program. But that's fundamentally it. Mark alluded to a paper that Dan and I co-authored with a couple of others 15, 16 years ago. And that's exactly that paper, Making the World Safe for Nuclear Power. It was exactly about arrangements of the fuel cycle that would discourage countries from having the capacities to lead to weapons material, ultimately by providing fuel security. Mm-hmm. And I'll just advertise, since you advertised this book, I'm going to do an advertisement.
I'm happy to advertise on your behalf as well.
Do an advertisement for, as just one step out of many that would be needed, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, way back, many years ago, had the idea of establishing a bank of low-enriched uranium under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency, such that any country that was in good standing on its safeguards obligations, if it had a break in the supply chain for whatever reason, like the United States says you're violating human rights things, for example, important, but we said we need to enforce the non-proliferation regime. Don't have enrichment. You will have fuel supply as long as you are observing non-proliferation norms. And NTI, Warren Buffett, a name I think well known here, Warren Buffett put in $50 million to be matched 2-to-1 for a $150 million fuel bank, which is now operating, located in Kazakhstan. So it's one little piece of building up a system where countries have confidence that they don't need enrichment to have secure nuclear fuel supply.
Yeah. Let me look at this from a geopolitical perspective and come to you, Dan, on this point about ensuring that countries have access to civilian nuclear power, but having some control over or some confidence that there isn't going to be a proliferation risk, or it's going to be less substantial than it might otherwise be. So it's my understanding that the United States or US companies were significantly involved with helping other countries get this capacity, and that did give us some ability to put provisions in place that would give us greater confidence about proliferation. Now that the US seems to be doing less of that, and China and Korea and other countries are doing more of that, is this moving in a worrying direction, or does the US still have a leadership role here to play?
We still have a leadership role to play, but the leadership role we once enjoyed has significantly eroded, and let me explain. The whole global system really goes back to President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, and the basic premise that was codified first in the International Atomic Energy Agency and its safeguard system, and second, in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which on Thursday will turn 50 years old, basically said that in exchange for countries committing to refrain from obtaining nuclear weapons, we would make the benefits of the peaceful use of the atom available. And we set up a whole safeguard system to basically enforce that with inspections and cameras and seals, et cetera, et cetera. The United States always was the global leader in this. And in fact, after India diverted nuclear technology intended for peaceful purposes to actually create an explosion, the United States Congress beefed up all of those controls that were codified in what was called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978, which then led to 25 years of diplomacy of the United States not only raising its own standards, requiring countries to accept full scope safeguards, imposing dual use export controls, et cetera, but actually diplomacy through the Nuclear Suppliers Group and other fora to get other countries to live up to that set of norms. It only works when we're selling our stuff because these laws require that countries that want our technology have to sign on to these standards. But if we make ourselves too unpleasant to deal with by insisting on standards that no one else insists upon, that are far beyond the four corners of what had been agreed through international treaties, countries are going to go elsewhere, and they have. So now the Russian order book for new nuclear reactors is reported to be on the order of $130 billion. You know, in places like Turkey, Bangladesh, India, other countries as well. They're going into, they're now trying to go into Africa and so forth. The United States order book is zero. We've finished building 4 units in China, and that's it. So if we fall out, then our influence will fall out with it. The only reason for hope is, in fact, some of these new technologies. There's still a tremendous admiration for the United States, our technology, our safety standards, yes, our security standards, and people want to go with us, but we're going to have to figure out how to get out of our own way, number one, and Ernie may speak to this, in terms of the requirements that we impose against other countries that no other supplier will require, but also the fact that other governments treat nuclear exports as a matter of geostrategic influence, and they bring the full weight to bear of their governments to support it with export credit financing, et cetera, we don't, or we don't do it well. And unless we can get our game back up to an A level, we're going to keep losing influence.
Just,
go ahead.
I was going to say, just to elaborate slightly on Dan referring to these agreements, bilateral agreements, to allow U.S. companies to transfer nuclear technology, called 123 agreements. The United States and the United Arab Emirates signed an agreement which is called the Gold Standard, in which the Emirates agreed voluntarily to forego any enrichment, any reprocessing, essentially forever. Little details I won't get into. And that's called the Gold Standard. It's something that we would like to have everywhere. But right now we can't find anyone else who would subscribe to the Gold Standard. And so particularly in the Middle East, as nuclear power expands potentially, significantly, including in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. Even Jordan is aspirational. They have all made clear that they would not subscribe to this, which takes the United States out of the game. And this is very significant. For one thing, with the Emirates, even though they chose Korean reactors, there was an enormous amount of U.S. content in the supply chain, and with that came the stringent non-proliferation norms. Well, if we say we're not going to get a 123 agreement with other countries, it's going to be tough. So it's a tough political call. I'll just say that in November, I published a paper at the Hoover Institution, George Shultz basically, in which we tossed out and for the aficionados, this would be controversial, that, 1, 2, 3 agreement, gold standard, that's the ideal. But, maybe when you consider all these factors and our role in nonproliferation, maybe we got to find another pathway to accomplish the same goal. And so, for example, suppose there were an agreement of one of those countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, whatever, to say, okay, we're not going to do a gold standard because that's giving away our birthright under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the idea of having an extraordinary verification regime, maybe one that looks sort of like that Iranian agreement, could be a way to go forward. So basing it on the verification aspects as opposed to the proscription approach. I don't know. We need to have some creative approach because the current system is only getting us into a deeper hole.
If I may just say one more thing. To your earlier question, we have lost global influence, and we can't call the shots. King Lear says, they told me I was everything, but I am not ague-proof. And so we sometimes think that if we take a certain position, that other countries have no options. It is not true. So if you take country X and you insist on a gold standard and they say no, they can go to Korea or France or Russia or China. The answer is not none of the above if they don't go our way. And that's why if we were actually serious about my simple line on the gold standard is not gold and it's not standard, but if we were serious about it, the thing to do is to go to the other suppliers and get them to sign up to the same standards, because until everyone signs up to the same set of rules, we're never going to have country 2 sign up to that standard.
Yeah.
And the no's have been just as clear from them as they have been from the other states.
But I imagine, and this is probably a road we don't want to go down too much, but I imagine at some point countries were signing up not just for help with their developing their nuclear program, but also to a broader relationship with the United States, right? So it's, the larger package was perhaps more appealing than it is right now in a day and age where there's uncertainty around America as a partner. So I think all of these things are wrapped together in geopolitical. I want to touch on just one thing that you've both touched on, and then I'm going to open to questions, and I'm going to hope that somebody asks Ernie about the Iran agreement, because that was on my list, but I want to make sure we get to questions.
As usual.
But before we throw it open, both of you had made references to these new technologies, and I think it's worth spending a couple of minutes on these new technologies in nuclear power. What are they? What are these advanced generation technologies? How much is promise? How much is reality? And what of the list of risks, waste, proliferation, do they really mitigate?
I'm going to let you start.
I'm going to let the scientist go first.
Oh, no, you start so I can criticize you.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Well, there's a whole host of advanced technologies. First of all, in terms, there's a general interest in going smaller. And you can go to what they call small modular reactors that are based on still the traditional so-called light water technology, and just tried to get certain efficiencies by having, instead of these individual massive bespoke projects which have huge regulatory complexities and change orders and things that drive costs through the roof, you punch out modular units in a factory, you put them on a truck, you ship them in, you can put down 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 of them, and you can use them in locations that don't have such great requirements in terms of grid size, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the vanilla version, and there's one that's quite far advanced, new scale. It's deep into the design certification process at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Then there's a whole wave of advanced generation technologies, which include ones that don't use light water any longer to cool and moderate the reactors. Some of them use molten salts. Some of them use sodium or liquid metal. Some of them use gas. And a lot of these have very attractive features in safety space in terms of moving from active safety systems that require electricity, offsite electricity, pumps and things like that, in a crisis like Fukushima could fail, Some of them, like a molten salt, the fuel form itself is liquid, and therefore, you're always worried about an overheating situation with a nuclear power plant. But if the overheated material expands, the neutrons get further apart. This is where I'm getting scared. I'm going to get in trouble with Ernie. And the reactivity slows down. So you have actual designs that passively shut themselves down and drastically reduce the risk of a loss of coolant accident. Those that use metals for coolants can be operated closer to atmospheric temperature, so the high pressure buildup that leads to the explosions that we've seen in the past is less of a risk. So there's a whole suite of benefits that accrue to these, and that's why there's actually quite a bow wave of enthusiasm. There's about 50 or 60 of these small companies in the U.S. They've attracted enormous amount of venture capital, and the U.S. government is investing in advanced demonstration reactors as well. So I think there is actually a lot of promise. And to my earlier sort of bleak assessment on U.S. global influence, if we are able to lead the global race to deploy this next generation, we could actually get our lead back.
Mm-hmm. And there's no reason at the moment to think that we will, to be perfectly honest. Because the Chinese are going and building prototypes, and while we have these 50, 60 companies, none of them can assemble the B behind the dollar sign to actually get things constructed right now. But let me say just a few points to emphasize. One is, as Dan said, there's a big focus in these advanced designs on safety and essentially eliminating the possibility of a bad accident. I'll just mention one because it's easy to kind of discuss some high temperature gas reactors. The point being, the fuel is put inside of graphite balls that cannot melt at any achievable temperature, for example. There are other things in terms of circulation, etc. Secondly, Dan mentioned the word factory. That is extremely important in this context. The idea that the entire nuclear piece could be done with the quality assurance and the learning curve that is typical of a manufacturing environment, as opposed to on-site construction, which tends to eat you alive in this business. But to realize the economic benefit of that factory environment means you can't just build one, and we can't even build one yet. You need an order book. You need an order book that's sufficient to invest in the tooling and all of this. So frankly, if we do not have, it's the name of the game in nuclear. If there is not an organized approach between government and the private sector in a public-private partnership, the dog don't hunt. And that's just the reality. I do want to comment just one other thing.
And I want to encourage people to, if they have questions, to start assembling behind the microphone,
right.
But please.
And because nuclear waste was mentioned, I want to make it clear that there's no magic bullet. Roughly speaking, you tell me how much electricity or technically how much heat you produce, and I'll tell you how many fission products you have, which dominate the waste for a long time. So we need another program that finally gets off the dime on nuclear waste, which in my view remains something that is scientific and technically well within our capability of doing. But clearly the political and social fabric just isn't there at the moment.
I just want to inject one very quick note of optimism before we go to the questions, to pick up on Ernie's comment about public-private partnerships. That's what got the industry going in the first place, between Admiral Rickover, who was developing reactors for our aircraft carriers, which then segued to the shipping port reactor, the first commercial nuclear power reactor in the United States. Again, maybe to be the cockeyed optimist in the room here, there is a lot of interest now in the Pentagon, based on a Defense Science Board report of 2016, in these very small, even micro reactors of 1 to 10 megawatts. And if there's a sufficient demand signal coming from the services based on the initial work that's happening in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where they're actually sponsoring the development of 3 separate designs for this possible new use of nuclear power, that could be the kind of thing that starts the public-private partnership, because on its own, I think the demand signal from the commercial sector, without that kind of public support, is not going to be sufficient to drive the investment that you need.
Interesting. Excellent. Okay, I'll begin over here on the left, and you all know the rules. Could you state your name? Please be brief, and please have your question end with a question mark. So over to you.
Hi, my name is Max Nadeau. I'm a first year at the college. And on the topic of new technologies, I was just wondering what you thought, and if you could talk about the possibilities of the political and technical possibilities of using thorium as a fuel source.
I'll let you do that.
Thorium is not a fissionable element. When thorium cycle is talked about, it inherently means that from the thorium you breed uranium-233, which is the fissile isotope, let's just say that, okay, and one of the attractions stated is that then starting with thorium, you don't then build up to these very heavier elements, even beyond plutonium and curium and everything else, and that's all true. However, it's also true that, at least if it's pure thorium, you have a serious proliferation challenge on your hands, because the uranium-233 can be practically pure. It is a wonderful, quotes wonderful, bomb material, which you could separate chemically, and inherently you are getting into a reprocessing cycle that I just don't see net you're really gaining anything. So I think, I understand India is very enthusiastic about thorium, but the reality is I think we've got to straighten out our act on uranium-powered reactors, for which today we certainly have no need of reprocessing.
Thank you. Yes, over here on the right.
Hi there, Stephen Mock. I'm a joint degree student at HBS in the Kennedy School. Given Super Tuesdays tomorrow, I wonder if you wanted to bring up the range of climate plans that have been announced over the past year, and they span from innovation to deployment, from ambition to pragmatism, and from embracing nuclear to shutting down nuclear. I wonder if you could talk about what policies you think are most important over the coming years, and what you're most concerned about, what could be counterproductive.
Well, this is a game anyone can play. So I would say, to a first order, it's distressing to me in debate after debate where you hear people talking about the gravity and the urgency of the climate threat, and the word nuclear never passes anyone's lips. And again, I keep using Ernie's famous line, it ain't math, it's arithmetic. And I think it's not serious, candidly speaking, to not consider this as an option, point one. Point two, there are things that can be done, and actually a lot of, I know Megan's mentioned this in the past about bipartisanship, there's a lot of even bipartisan support for doing things like putting a carbon tax in place, or some burden on carbon. That would put a thumb on the scale in a very important way, get you at least part of the way, even with cheap natural gas, to the kind of economics that might be favorable. Because let's face it, if you actually got your arms around what's very challenging economics for nuclear, then I think a lot of these other concerns about safety and waste, et cetera, would, I think, be handled more easily. So I think that's really important. And indeed, if markets could get restructured, not only by putting a price on carbon, by putting some economic rewards in place for the economic rewards that nuclear confers in terms of resilience, in terms of always being available, in terms of flexibility in the grid, I think that's going to be really important. I would note that I got a lot of calls at the Department of Energy in January 2014 from people who were suffering from the polar vortex, and they were awfully glad the nuclear power plants kept running even when the coal and the gas plants shut down. So I think, frankly, we need what I would call reality therapy And I think people have to understand what Ernie was saying in the very first answer, that you can take all the wind and all the solar you want and deploy it, and it's not going to solve the problem. I went to Ohio, my home state, to testify to save those nuclear power plants. If they had shut down those nuclear power plants, just to break even, they would have had to put solar panels on every house in Ohio. So we got to get out of this zero-sum game in which you're having renewable power push out nuclear, because that's not the way to get to zero in terms of CO2 emissions.
Since you mentioned Super Tuesday,
we had a very short reprieve from the political cycle. Now
right.
It's ended.
I would just say
45 minutes.
Go to energyfuturesinitiative.com. We won't ask for money, but the reason I raise that is that if I actually go back to your question, we have on there a framework for the work that we do, which we call the Green Real Deal. It takes the Green New Deal principles for energy and climate, which is a very small part of it, but it's only two. It says you got to go to low carbon, and you got to put social justice in the foreground in getting there. And we say absolutely. And now we got to build a program. So what does that mean now to build a program? That's what we call the Green Real Deal. And answer your question, so this is about what's the approach. We got to be pragmatic and build coalitions. There is never a large, sustained change in this country if you haven't started with a coalition. Magical thinking, either in defining the problem or in defining the solution, does not build a coalition. It breaks coalitions. So, coalition building is absolutely critical. In doing that, it's important to sustain optionality and flexibility. The more options you have for going to that deeply decarbonized future and doing so with social equity in mind, the better, and that's where the nuclear option comes in. Solutions, however, will be regional. Neither nuclear nor anything else is a magic bullet for all geographies. That's, again, we got to get away from the rigidity, I've got the answer.
Right.
Congratulations. Now, move on, please, so I can get serious. So clearly innovation is central to all of this, but those are the characteristics, and optionality, flexibility, looking at all the possible contributors to the solution is what is needed, including not just kind of efficiency and supply and use, but also, we alluded to it very briefly earlier, if we're going to get to net zero, we're going to have large-scale negative carbon technologies. Right. So all of this has got to come together, and it is painful to me to see whether it's nuclear, even more so than nuclear, I would argue, things like carbon capture and sequestration, right. Negative carbon technologies. So many people, well-meaning, but they want to take them off the table. It is disastrous for having any chance of meeting the kinds of stringent goals that we need to reach.
Thank you. Up in the eaves there.
My name's Randy Feldman. I'm an attorney and a student at the Extension School. First, what do we do with the spent fuel rods and the waste? What is the best thing to do with that? What is the possibility of fusion energy? And lastly, Dr. Moniz, how did you ever become the point person in the political Iranian deal, and what are we to do now? I mean, as a scientist, how did you get that, and what are we to do?
I'm sorry, did you say in the Iran deal? Is that you said?
Yeah.
Oh, Iran deal. Okay.
Yeah. I forgot to say one question a person.
That was 3 questions.
Here. But maybe if we can try to hit those quickly. Do you want to be?
I'll quickly hit the spent fuel thing. When we were together at the U.S. Department of Energy, we got 2 great Americans, Lee Hamilton and General Brent Scowcroft, to lead a excellent commission on the America's future, but it was really about the used fuel problem. We don't like to call it spent fuel because that sounds like garbage. And
he actually calls it pre-owned fuel usually.
Yeah. But, right. And I'm going to give it a Blue Book value, you know. So So this is a process solution. You know, it's not so much a technical problem as a political problem. It turns out that trying to shove a repository down the throat of an unwilling state isn't a very successful strategy. But if you look to a place like Finland or Sweden, where they had a patient consent-based approach to citing a repository, they actually ended up, in the case of Sweden, of two communities bidding for the opportunity to host a repository. What you can do is, after it cools for a number of years in a spent fuel pond, you can consolidate it in centralized, huge 150-ton casks in dry storage for a long period of time, and then ultimately you can do it, put it in geologic formations that seal up and are demonstrated to contain the radioactivity for long periods of time. And if people, I think, took greater heed of the kind of approach that the Finns and the Swedes took, then I think we could move down a similar direction. The French are also moving in a similar direction. But that's a brief answer, and I'll let Ernie take the more personalized question there.
Well, first of all, I'll just add to that that a little-known fact is that in 2016, President Obama issued an executive order overturning an executive order put out by President Reagan. It's a different time now, which allowed separation of civilian spent fuel and the weapons-generated waste, which is a big nuclear waste challenge. That's important because there's a pathway now that we can use the greater flexibility for geological isolation of nuclear waste, of nuclear weapons waste, in one track, and on the civilian side, to do what Dan said, we should be moving now to consolidating that spent fuel in dry casks on the way to future geological isolation, which is what we should have always done, but unfortunately our statutory framework isn't there. On fusion, your second question was fusion. Truth in Advertising, I'm on the board of one of the several private fusion companies, private meaning working on private capital, have been for a long time. I think there is more innovation in the nuclear space broadly, certainly in the fusion space, than there's ever been. And I actually believe that we will kind of know, my favorite phrase, if the dog hunts, in this decade. I didn't say we would be at the place of having, large-scale commercial power, but I think we'll know if we can solve the science problem in this decade. I'm optimistic in that sense. The third, you should really ask President Obama that question, but I'll just be very brief that first of all, the reality is the Department of Energy was involved in the Iran negotiation from the beginning, because that's where the nuclear expertise is in the country, and especially in the national laboratories and the like. So that was always the case. What changed was that in early 2015, the negotiation was stuck, frankly, and in a funny way, simultaneous decisions, shall we say, were taken in the United States and Iran that their, let's call it, chief nuclear officers needed to get in to negotiate the complex, interrelated issues that would meet the red lines that we had for the negotiation. I'm not going to, it's a long story, but fundamentally, I do think it's the case that my counterpart Salehi, Ali Salehi, who was a student at MIT, got his PhD at MIT, and I had a lot of things in common in our backgrounds. That allowed an excellent relationship upon which we could use our technical expertise to put together a program that worked on that side. And then John Kerry and Zarif, of course, were doing the other side with sanctions and the political side, et cetera. It's a pretty unusual. I don't know if it'll ever be replicated, but it worked this time. And actually, I have to say, my last comment will be, when you think about it, Salehi and I were injected in the middle of February, and a deal was signed in the middle of July. When you think about it, it seemed like a long time at the time, but it was actually only a few months, and it got done. So, yeah.
Yeah, we'll wait for the movie on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, we have no
and
more than...
George Clooney is playing me, by the way.
Of course, I would have guessed as much. We have no more than 10 minutes. I'm going to try to get at least 3 more questions. If I could go up here, please.
Sure. I'm Andrew Kingsbury. I'm also at the Extension School, senior studying government. If you were advising a presidential candidate, say Joe Biden perhaps, what would you, as a messaging strategy, repeat these 2 to 3 sentences, what would you tell that candidate to say about nuclear post-Fukushima to allay like safety concerns and things like that, maybe about the new reactors and so on, if you had like 2 to 3 sentences to kind of do that?
2 to 3 sentences.
Well, okay, my first of all, my advice would be very different before the election and then after he won. Before the election, I would not suggest making this a big point.
That's a good answer.
Not a political winner.
No, I don't think it's. I don't
Dan?
think there's much upside.
I mean,
whereas I would be advising about a very, very strong statement about climate change and the need to get to very, very deep decarbonization and how we really need every tool at our disposal to get there.
I would just add, after the election, I would make that point, but I'd always talk about global leadership, because nuclear energy is not just a choice for America. There's 440 reactors operating around the world. And whatever you think about nuclear energy, or even nuclear energy in the United States, you have to want those reactors to be safe and secure in non-proliferation space. And if you care about nuclear safety and you care about nuclear security, you have to want U.S. leadership, because we're the second to none power in those areas. That's a leadership message. I think that's a message that can carry bipartisanship with it, which is what I agree with Ernie we need in this kind of multi-decadal system, so that's what I would add.
No, so Dan, let me just clear. So again, that was the advice before the election.
Yeah.
After the election, I think there's even more.
I was trying to be brief.
But I think, no, but I think that, and now I'm putting together the climate, the nuclear energy nexus, and the nuclear security issues more broadly. We need a major focus that starts at the beginning of an administration, whether it's President Trump or the Democratic nominee, we don't know yet, obviously. No matter who it is, we need a serious systemic look at all of these nuclear issues. President Obama did that when he was in office just a couple months in Prague, and gave a speech which then led to literally an 8-year set of activities and progress in many ways. We need that, and it involves nuclear weapons issues. For example, we've written a lot about the very bad state of affairs that we are in right now in terms of the U.S. and Russia, which still have over 90% of the nuclear weapons, after all, in the world, lack of dialogue, all kinds of issues, miscalculation risks, etc. But all of those nuclear fuel cycle issues need to come in, as Dan said, and we really need this next administration to take a comprehensive view of that.
Great.
And put it on the front burner.
Thank you. Could I take a question here?
Hello, my name is Andreas. I'm at the Fletcher School. I'm from Argentina, so I have a question about the replicability of the ABAC agreement between Brazil and Argentina. Looking at the proliferation crisis, do you believe that this agreement could be a path forward, or what lessons learned do we have from them?
My colleague here's first book was on Argentina, so he's going to grab that.
Fue mi segundo libro. Sí. Me fuiste ahí a ABAC. So ABAC, for those, maybe one or two who don't know, is the Argentine-Brazil commission that was set up after President Sarney and President Alfonsín met at Foz de Iguaçu way back in 1989. At the time, the United States was very ambivalent about this. I'll be brief because I know we're going to have a couple other questions. Because we were pushing everyone to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we thought anything that wasn't that thing, or perhaps the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which was this sort of blessed Latin America version of that, was a bad thing. I did not think it was a bad thing. I thought this was a good way for the two sides to establish mutual confidence. I've actually visited the headquarters of ABAC, which is in Rio de Janeiro, and I think it's a very fine institution that is supplementing both of these other treaties. And in fact, of course, Brazil and Argentina both ended up joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think it served its purpose. I think it gives the two sides mutual confidence, and I think it's a good thing.
Okay, our last question, Sultan.
Sultan Al-Thari, master's student in Middle Eastern Studies. My question is to Dr. Moniz. It's regarding the Iran deal. Many argue that it had severe limitations, particularly with regards to the weak sunset provisions that merely delayed Iran's ability to obtain a nuclear weapon, in addition to the fact that it didn't address Iran's ballistic and cruise missile program, which could deliver nuclear warheads. In addition, revenue generated from the deal was not given to the Iranian populace, rather was given to proxies around the region, which arguably fueled greater conflict. How are these issues addressed in those negotiations, and how would a future deal look like with these issues in mind? I mean, we recently learned through the IAEA that there were uranium particles at undeclared sites in Iran. How does that tie into a safer future for the Middle East?
Well, let me first of all say that it is not correct that the revenue from the deal went to proxies in the region and not to the Iranians. Some clearly went to the Revolutionary Guard and went out just pretty much as we had anticipated, but they have, as is evident now, and even more so, they have lots and lots of issues to take care of internally with the funds. And the funds, by the way, essentially didn't add up to anything much more than the oil revenue, which they were able to restart, because foreign investment was basically zero. Foreign companies were happy to sell products like airplanes, but not to invest large amounts of money. But going back to the other part of the question, look, first of all, let me say that and people can disagree, but the decision was clearly made by President Obama and then by the allies, well, not only the European allies and Russia and China, that a negotiation would be entered into that strictly addressed the nuclear weapon issue, the existential issue. Number one, that is not uncommon. It's no different, in my view, from Ronald Reagan negotiating arms control in the middle of tremendous issues with the Soviet Union. You take that issue off the table first. Secondly, I think the credibility of negotiating that whole set of issues is just isn't there. Russia was in Syria, for example. You think expanding the negotiation to all of the regional conflicts was going to be practical? No. But by focusing on the nuclear issue first, Russia was very constructive in getting this agreement to happen. There's stories. Read it in my book, my first book, Dan. It'll come out soon.
I can't wait.
So that's an issue. The issue, as always stated, the idea was to put in place a foundation of this agreement upon which one would then build to address the other issues. And in my view, we needed to turn up the temperature a lot in addressing those other issues, but that's a separate question. In terms of the agreement itself, in a nutshell, the agreement was two things. It was significant constraints on Iran's activity for 15 years, which is no longer being observed, although, to be honest, they haven't exactly gone gangbusters I mean, technically they've said they are no longer under any of those constraints, but they haven't really, quotes, broken out in any sense. But the more important part of the deal was the verification regime. And today, the IAEA will still tell you that they are observing the verification regime. The Iranians have said directly, we'll see if this holds true going forward, but they have said they understand that the foundation of the international community having confidence that they are not, they don't say resuming, doing a weapons program lies in the verification regime, and they are going to stay with that. Now we'll see if they stay with that or not, but that's the statement. It is not, frankly, I think the media coverage on this is abysmal in not stressing that the verification regime remains in place.
Okay, on that happy note, I apologize to people who still had some questions that we didn't get to, but I'd like you all to join me in thanking Ernie and Dan for a spectacular tour de force.
And thank you.
And I hope we agree that we're all leaving a little bit wiser. And for me, my previous experience with nuclear reactors involved visiting Chernobyl in 2016. So you've given me some much more positive mental images than that sarcophagus kind of crumbling.
The sarcophagus, yeah.
So anyway,
all right.
thank you all tonight.
So who are you
Thank
voting
you.
for tomorrow? Right.
Thank you, IOP.
Thank you guys. That was great.